Welcome to Furthering Christendom. I'm your host, Tyler McNabb, and I'm here today with a good friend of mine, Dr. Joshua Brown. In fact, we go back to when we were both Baptists at Southeastern Seminary, and I'm talking some years ago now. So, thanks for coming on, Joshua.
Thank you very much for having me, Tyler. It's a pleasure to be a part of your YouTube channel.
Yeah, no, thanks for coming on, and appreciating that kind of the Orthodox beard you got going on. It almost kind of looks like Father Barish, a little bit there.
Hey, I'll take that. Yeah.
So you got a new book out just recently, edited collection of essays on Eastern Christianity and philosophy. Can you tell me a little bit about the book project?
Sure. I have a copy here. I like to show off
Excellent.
the
I don't
pretty
have
cover.
my copy yet, so I need you to show yours. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I pestered the publisher, and hopefully they'll send it to you. Yeah, it's a really well, I might be biased, but I think it's a really cool volume. It draws together kind of an eclectic group of philosophers, some of them specializing in ancient philosophy, analytic philosophy, and continental philosophy. And it includes Orthodox Christian philosophers and also some Eastern Catholic philosophers. Um, and so it's pretty neat volume. It covers a range of different topics. So some
Can you give me an example? What some of those chapters are about?
Yeah, definitely. So it's got some of the chapters deal with kind of the origins of Eastern Christian thought, and kind of deal with the historical side of things. And then we have importantly chapters that cover kind of philosophical theology and philosophy of religion and religious epistemology.
Yeah, I heard that guy though that wrote that chapter is a little bit of a kook. I don't know.
Yeah, some say he's a crackpot.
Okay. To put it nicely. So the philosophy of religion, philosophical theology chapters. Can you tell us kind of what the chapters are titled and who they're by?
Yes, so we've got a excellent chapter by Bo Branson, who talks about discussions in St. Gregory of Nyssa and his conception of action and how that played a role in his kind of explication of Trinitarian theology. And then he takes that and applies it to kind of contemporary discussions and philosophy of action. And then we have an excellent chapter on kind of the concept of divine impassibility, and kind of bringing Eastern Christian approaches to that to bear into the contemporary discussion. And then I've got a chapter that brings a kind of apophatic theism and uses that to respond to contemporary arguments for the non-existence of God.
Okay, so apophatic theism. Can you help our listeners help us understand what that is all about?
With pleasure. So apophatic theism is sometimes mistaken as being the conception of God that says that you can't say anything about God whatsoever, like you just can't apply any concepts to God. But that's not entirely accurate. I mean, I suppose there's been some people who've said that, some contemporary folks, but historically, it's actually the view that we can't say anything about what kind of entity God is. So we can't say anything about God's essence, but we can still know some things about God. And the type of things we can know about God are what in the Eastern Christian tradition we talk about God's activities or his energies, and we can know things about God's activities. We can predicate things of God, but these predicates are analogies. So we don't use univocal language to talk about God. And so, roughly speaking, that's the view of there's things we can say when we talk. I guess when we do refer to God's essence, we only use negations. So sometimes it's referred to negative as being negative theology. We can say things like God is unlimited or uncircumscribable or unknowable, those kind of things. But when we say that, we're not actually predicating God these kind of strange properties like being unknowable or being formless. Rather, we're just kind of making assertions about the type of properties God doesn't instantiate. So
And that way you sort of avoid the kind of self-defeat charge, right? I mean, I'm sure you're quite familiar with that in certain circles, right? Where, oh, God's unknowable, so that's something positive you're predicating to God, right?
yeah, that's a really common objection. You see it in contemporary literature. I haven't been able to fully trace where that comes from. William Austin, that he kind of has that approach to apophaticism, and then you see it in Planiga and Ryan Mullins more recently. Kind of they kind of start off assuming apophaticism is this idea, like I said, where you just can't make any predications of God, and so then they kind of they point out, well, isn't this a self-defeating view? Because you say God is formless or unknowable or timeless. Oh, you're making all these predications. But really, these kind of negative properties, properly understood, are not asserting that God possesses these kind of unique properties, but rather they're just kind of pointing out that God doesn't instantiate these properties. And it's not arbitrary. That's another important point. It's not like, let's just arbitrarily choose some properties that God doesn't instantiate. It's really anything that you can univocally predicate about a structure or form, exemplifying entities, you can negate of God. That's kind of the rule of thumb that apophatic theists follow.
So you mean there's obviously going to be a lot of, for my Thomist viewers who are watching, a lot of amening right now, right? In a logical language, yes, no univocal predication, positive univocal predication, that sort of thing. One of the biggest debates that I'm familiar with when it comes to kind of where Thomists and some people who Palamites, you might call them, disagree is about like if there's like an actual real distinction between God's essence and energies. Can you just tell me a little bit about your view on that?
Sure. Yeah, this is a really important point of disagreement between those kind of working within the Thomistic tradition and then many Orthodox or Eastern Christian philosophers. And yeah, so for Thomists, there's no distinction between God's essence and God's activities. So what God is kind of identical to what God does, God's action. Whereas in the Eastern tradition, really you see it in the Cappadocian Fathers and Saint Maximus, and especially in Saint Gregory Palamas. They like to draw this distinction between God's essence and God's activities, and there's some debate then there about how we understand divine simplicity. That plays a role in this. So a really kind of strong formulation of divine simplicity is going to deny that God even has any metaphysical kind of distinctions, like a distinction between what God is and what God does. Whereas Eastern Christians don't always endorse that kind of strong version of divine simplicity, are willing to concede that there is a distinction. But there's even some variation amongst Orthodox. So there are some Orthodox Christians that might actually endorse that strong form of simplicity.
Right, right. So for your chapter, so I just kind of catching everyone up. So the kind of idea that the sort of theism that you're advocating for, right? What I guess kind of like a very kind of weak argument or straw man argument against that is like you're basically a functional atheist.
Yeah.
You know, um, you would say normally you're just misunderstanding everything, right? You're misunderstanding. We're not against analogical use of language. We're just talking about can we give positive predications to God's essence, right? So we're not endorsing some sort of functional atheism here. And then I'm assuming you would say that that's how. Am I summarizing rightly how you would take on that objection?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, I mean, it's an epistemological kind of claim, the divine ineffability. It is rooted in some ontological assumptions, um, but yeah, it's just saying you can't know anything about God's essence. Um, it's not saying that there's no such thing as God. It can get tricky when we talk about saying, well, God exists.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, does he exist or does he like exist star?
right. I mean, there's
Right.
complications there because when we talk about things existing, and especially like if you want to draw on this kind of Thomistic framework that draws on Aristotle, we're talking about some kind of composite of form and matter.
Right. That's right.
Um, and
Something that
so,
possesses properties. Um,
yeah,
yeah.
right. So obviously, then, yeah, an apophatic theist is going to say, well, no, God doesn't exemplify a form because that would limit him. That would say that God is limited to, because the form, traditionally understood, is kind of what determines what thing you are, and it limits the range of like natural powers you have, which is why like I have the form of a human. I can't, do things that a
Can't
spitting cobra,
fly.
or I can't,
Yeah,
it's
no
much
spitting out acid.
more. um, And so, yeah, but then that gets tricky because obviously, then if we talk about, if we want to say, oh, God exists, clearly we don't mean the same thing we do when we say that, like, you and I exist or a tree exists. Um, so that's where that,
God's like not a thing, but rather the grounding of things. That which makes things possible.
yeah, yeah,
So,
exactly.
and this kind of gets to a different conception of God, right? I know we're both fans of a similar sort of conception of God, and not so much fans of a view that kind of anthropomorphizes God, whatever you want to call it. If you want to call it neo-theistic personalism or neoclassical theism or whatever it may be, right?
Right.
Um, there's kind of two different ways of construing God. One much more in line with like pseudo Dionysius, um, where he is no thing, he's ineffable and no positive predications, and but yet his existence, or if you want to say exist star, compared to say some other like a super mind that's in the same, can be put in the same genre as you and I, same category as you and I, and who's just, but it's just like all just much smarter or much more powerful, or a much more moral agent, right? As opposed to not being a moral agent whatsoever. Um, and so, yeah, these kind of different conceptions of God seems like atheists primarily target this much more anthropomorphic conception of God. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And that's precisely what I argue in my chapter, my contribution to the volume. Is I kind of, go through helpfully Eugen Nagasawa has categorized all of the various arguments, contemporary arguments for the non-existence of God. And I kind of go through those. He uses the labels type A, type B, type C arguments. Um, what they all have in common is exactly what you just pointed out. They're targeting uh, this anthropomorphic conception of God. And as you pointed out, there's some debate amongst philosophers of religion today about what term we want to use. Some people prefer neoclassical theism. In my chapter, I use the term theistic personalism, um, and I admit that's not maybe the perfect term to use, but that's what I went with.
I will
But
say, when I was a theistic personalist, I would take the label of theistic personalism with pride. I was like, yeah, that's right. God's a person.
yeah,
But so I'm not so sure why the negative feedback to that, but nonetheless, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, I will, you can't make everyone happy, I guess. So, yeah, and I kind of try to zero in on kind of the core thesis, that a theistic personalist, that makes you a theistic personalist. And roughly that's the idea that you believe that there exists a person, P, such that P essentially possesses what I call these maximal person properties, and that's omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence. Those tend to be the main properties always focused on simultaneously, and that's important too. Um, and that becomes the target of virtually every contemporary argument for the non-existence of God. So the different types, have different strategies. So type A arguments try to point out that there's some incoherence with one of the properties, like, oh, you could never have an omnipotent being. Maybe you point to the paradox of the stone, that kind of problem. Then there's type B arguments that want to say, well, there's some kind of inconsistency between two of these properties. You couldn't have a person that was simultaneously omnipotent and omniscient, or something like that. And then you have probably the most popular, or the type C, and that's where you get the evidential argument for evil. So they want to point to some fact in the world, like the fact of seemingly gratuitous evil, and then say that makes it unlikely or highly improbable that a person that possesses those maximal person properties exists. And yeah, you kind of hinted at this. One other important aspect of this conception of God is it really considers the difference between God and creatures as one of degree. So, like you kind of pointed out, like the big difference on this conception of God between me and God is, I have some knowledge to a kind of limited degree. God has it to a maximal degree. Like, he's omniscient, and I have some power, but he has, like, he's superpowered. And these are typically understood in a univocal way. Like, God has some knowledge, just like I have knowledge, but to this maximal degree. So I begin by kind of making that case, establishing that this is the conception of God, this anthropomorphic or theistic personalism, neoclassical theism, whatever you want to call it. This is a conception of God that's being targeted by these contemporary arguments for atheism. And then after that, I kind of developed then apophatic theism, and kind of discuss reasons why one might adopt this view, clarify what the view entails and what it means, what it says about God. And then I use that to show that these kind of contemporary arguments for atheism, really, if you adopt apophatic theism, they're unsound, because it's just false that, according to apophatic theism, it's false that God is a person in the same sense that you and I are a person that possesses these essential properties simultaneously. In fact, there's no way in which, according to apophatic theism, there's just in principle no way that we could really say anything about God's essence and talk about God as being like a bundle of properties that we could, that we can grasp.
Right. Yeah. Because maybe he has something like a property or functionally plays the role of a property or something like that, but God doesn't have properties in any sort of univocal sense. Which is what I'm guessing is what you're, what you would say. Can we kind of maybe make this practical? Let's take maybe an example or two from these types of arguments, and then just maybe flesh out a bit more in detail about why these arguments wouldn't work, assuming this apophatic theology.
Yeah, actually, so one thing I did in the chapter, I'm going to just flip to that page.
Please do.
I tried to do a concise formulation of the contemporary argument for atheism, to make it easier to see how you can use apophatic theism as a response. So roughly the structure of this contemporary argument for atheism is as follows. First premise says, if God exists, he is a person who essentially possesses the maximal person properties simultaneously. Then a second premise states, it is not the case that any person possesses the maximal person properties simultaneously. Conclusion is, therefore, God does not exist. And really all these type A, type B, type C arguments, you could think of them as the supporting arguments for that second premise. So why should we believe that it is not the case that any person possesses these maximal person properties simultaneously? Well, because of enter type A argument, omnipotence is just an incoherent concept. No person could be omnipotent, or enter type A argument. No being could be both omnipotent and omniscient.
Because both these are assuming that we're predicating to these God to God in a univocal way. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And then again, to look at the strongest ones, like the argument from evidential argument for evil and the divine hiddenness argument. I mean, these are both similarly going to support that second premise by just pointing out that there's some fact in the world like gratuitous evil, or the fact that there are, according to the divine hiddenness argument, these non-resistant non-believers. These make it highly unlikely or improbable that a being possessing those properties simultaneously exists. So what the apophatic response does is it really looks at the first premise of this argument. And typically what's happened in the literature over the years is that everyone's really focused on that second premise. So you have people really trying to tackle each individual type of argument for the non-existence of God and debate over it. You have theists saying, no, that argument doesn't work for these reasons, and they go back and forth. Typically what happens is they start refining these definitions. So, what we mean by omnipotent is this, and that's compatible.
Right. Right.
That goes on and on. You get more and more complex definitions of these properties. But with this kind of response, I say it's more economical, because really it just looks at that first premise, the assumption that you have to hold to get these arguments off the ground, and that's that God is this theistic personalist conception of God. God's a person who possesses these properties. And it says, well, that premise is false. And so, and it's not just false because it picked out the wrong properties. Oh no, that's not God. God's not the omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent being. He's, whatever, fill in the blank. It's in principle, no, God just isn't any being that's a bundle of properties. And that's a mistake. And, in principle, we couldn't know what God is. So that that first premise is just false, which makes the argument unsound. So that's my strategy.
Really interesting. I'm a big fan of your approach and what you do in the chapter. Have you ever read James Anderson's work on what is it, Paradox in Christian Theology?
No, but I'd really like to.
Yes, I think you'd really like it. I mean, it's a little bit more coming from an epistemic route. Yours is a bit more, kind of metaphysical route. But I think y'all's work would complement each other a lot. Great. Well, what are you working on now, Joshua? What are in your sights for the in the foreseeable future? What are you thinking about?
Well, I've got the two papers I'm working on. One is, so my doctoral thesis was on the eutaxiological argument for the existence of God, and so I'm trying to work on a paper defending that argument, and then I'm actually working on a response. So I don't know if you've read Eugen's chapter in the recent volume on the problem of evil, where he defends a problem of evil for atheists.
Right.
It's a really interesting chapter. And anyways, recently in Religious Studies, there was a kind of a rebuttal paper published criticizing Eugen. And I didn't find it to be very persuasive. So I'm kind of working on a response to that. I emailed Eugen and was like, hey, I'm thinking of responding to him unless you're already working on it. And he's like, no, I don't have time. So please be my guest. So
nice.
Yeah, so I'm working on that.
You got to figure out a way to include Nutter Butters into the paper. All right.
Yes.
In one of your examples. So.
Okay, I promise. I'll work that.
Awesome. Yeah. Maximally great.
Yes. Okay.
Well, very good, Josh. Well, thanks for coming on, man. And hopefully have you on in the near future, maybe talking about some of these papers you're talking about now. So thanks for coming on, and hope you have a wonderful day.
You as well, Tyler. I appreciate you inviting me on.